2D to 3D. It's a transition that's not always made so smoothly. Some franchises have managed to pull it off flawlessly, replicating the feel of the original 2D games without suffering from the lack of quality game design. Many franchises don't survive the leap too well. Some don't even bother trying. It's an intimidating decision to bring your IP into the third dimension, and because of that, Rayman 2 wasn't always intended to be a 3D game. Rayman 2 was originally intended to be a 2D side-scroller, much like its predecessor. It was planned for release on the PlayStation, with the Jaguar version getting the boot in favor of the Sega Saturn this time around. This 2D build of the game played a lot like the first Rayman game, though Rayman would start the game with all of the powers he obtained in Rayman 1, and then obtaining even more on top of that. Come to think of it, Banjo-Tooie did the exact same thing. However, by the time of development, the platforming genre was currently popularized by 3D games, games like Mario 64, Crash Bandicoot, and Spyro the Dragon, so developing a 2D game at this time likely wouldn't draw that much interest. The spark happened in '96 when the developers of Rayman saw the first Crash game at E3. This made them realize the potential a platforming game could have in the third dimension. It was then decided to scrap this 2D prototype of Rayman in favor of making a 3D platforming game. But there was one little problem. At this time, they have never made a 3D game before, and they didn't know if they could make a good 3D Rayman game. So, they didn't. Instead, they made Tonic Trouble, a 3D platformer released for the N64. By developing this title, Ubisoft was able to test the engine that they would then use to build Rayman 2. Once they were comfortable with working in a 3D space and confident in their abilities to do so, Rayman 2 began redevelopment as a 3D title. Despite being originally intended for the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn, Ubisoft Montpellier turned to the N64 this time around for the basis of development. It was also ported to PC, releasing just days after the N64 version, with the Dreamcast port seeing a release months later. It wasn't until a year later that Rayman 2 would see a port on the PlayStation 1, the very console that Rayman owes most of his success to. Poor Sony got the short end of the stick this time around, as the PlayStation version of Rayman 2 is lacking chunks and chunks of levels. A year they had to make this port, and what do? Add voice acting?
Rayman?
While the original had mumbo-jumbo accompanied by text, kinda Banjo-Kazooie style,
You want me modest too, Colin Brooks?
the PS1 version was fully voice acted.
Not really. I feel weak and my powers have disappeared.
So they added voice acting, but they removed half the game. Not a good sacrifice if you ask me. I don't know if it had something to do with the sound files taking up all the disk space, but either way, wasn't worth it. While the PlayStation was in tears over this butchered port, the Dreamcast was having a blast with its definitive version of Rayman 2. The Dreamcast version was left completely intact from the N64 version. It simply had a higher frame rate, smoother graphics, and some extra minigames. For this video, I'll be taking a look at the Dreamcast version, since it's pretty much the definitive version of the game. Unless you want to count all the console ports and the mobile ports, and I'm not getting into those. Like, for real this time, I'm not getting into those. We're doing this again, aren't we? After Rayman 2's grand success, a remake for PS2 called Rayman 2 Revolution was developed in 2001. It was an enhanced port of Rayman 2 with an all-new hub world, some new bosses, and some other additional content. Many years later, in 2005, the N64 version of Rayman 2 was then ported to the Nintendo DS, retitled Rayman DS. I bought this game years ago thinking it was a brand new Rayman game, but I guess I probably should have done my homework. Then in 2010, Rayman 2 was ported to iOS. Go figure. It was also ported to the 3DS in 2011, titled Rayman 3D. Oh, well that wasn't too bad, but that's still a lot of times to re-release the exact same game asking for full price each and every time. And they're still doing it 10 years later, and that's a little bit ridiculous. I remember the very first time I played this game. It was the N64 version, which unfortunately I no longer have. I would probably have been about 7 years old at the time. My mom would always take me to rent a game on the way back from the grocery store, and every single time I got Yoshi's Story. I was a dumb kid, and I really liked that game. I was obsessed with Yoshi's Story. Now I know better, and I know it kinda sucks, but what can you do? I was like 8. Anyway, so after begging my mom to rent it for probably the 4th time in a row, she says, "James, you get that exact same game every time we come here. Why don't you get something different, something new this time, something you haven't played already? What do we got here? Rayman 2, this looks fun as she reaches out for the game. Oh god, I cried out in protest. I don't want Rayman, Rayman looks stupid, I want Yoshi, give me Yoshi, Rayman looks dumb, he doesn't have arms and legs, I want Yoshi. Completely ignoring me, Mom gets Rayman 2. Best decision she's ever made, because that weekend was unlike any other. Years and years later, I'm now a proud owner of the Sega Dreamcast version of the game. So why don't we check it out? I can never get used to how loud the Dreamcast gets when it reads a disc. It sounds like the thing's going to explode. Unlike the N64 version of Rayman 2, the Dreamcast version also supports widescreen. Rayman 2 boasts a radically darker tone than Rayman 1 did, as the story starts off with a slave ship that has captured and imprisoned the majority of Rayman's people. We then see Rayman's best friend Globox being dragged along and thrown into a cell with Rayman. Reunited with his friend, Rayman jumps for joy, but that joy doesn't last. Things look bleak, the world is enslaved, and Rayman has been robbed of all of his powers. Globox brings good news as Lee the Fairy, I guess they just forgot about Batilla the Fairy and made up a new one, gave Globox a silver lum, an energy core that will restore some of Rayman's power, giving him the ability to escape. Hence the name Rayman 2, The Great Escape. Once off of the prison ship, Globox is then separated from Rayman. This is where the first level starts, and we quickly become familiar with the 3D world of Rayman. You'll start out with the majority of the powers you obtain in Rayman 1, helicopter hair and all. Instead of throwing his fists, Rayman now shoots small energy spheres that can bounce off of walls. It's cool, but I honestly miss the concept of Rayman throwing his hands through the air to punch. I mean, what good is having hands detached from your body if you can't throw them through the air? It's not long before we're introduced to another brand new Rayman character, Murphy. He's a frog fairy thing, I think? He'll drop on by every now and then to explain game mechanics and give you tutorials. Cages, while containing the enslaved Electoons in Rayman 1, now contain Lums, the energy fairies that make up the heart of the world. There are 1,000 Lums in all, scattered across the entire world by Razorbeard. This is the bastard that enslaved the entirety of Rayman's people along with Rayman himself. This guy's a much worse villain than Mr. Dark could have ever hoped to be. Razorbeard destroyed the heart of the world, making all peace and stability cease to exist. If Rayman wants to restore it, he's gonna have to collect all of these Lums. You can find yellow Lums scattered all throughout each level. You'll need a certain amount of them to access certain stages later in the game, so make sure you pick these guys up when you see them. Yellow Lums aren't the only kind of Lum in Rayman 2, as there's also the red Lums that'll restore Rayman's health, along with the returning purple Lum that Rayman can once again use to swing across large gaps. While searching for Globox, Rayman then runs into some of his kids, who tell Rayman that the Robo-Pirates have taken Lee the Fairy away. Chasing after her, Rayman then runs into the Teensies, a disorganized group of little dudes that cannot figure out which one of them is king. Rayman 2 may have a darker toned story, but it still has a lot of quirky and adorable humor. They then open up a place called the Island of Doors. This is what serves as the hub world. The Dreamcast version is quite a bit different, as in other versions it's known as the Hall of Doors, and while it still takes form of a Mario World styled map, it's very different visually. Honestly, I much prefer the Hall of Doors from other versions than the Island of Doors from the Dreamcast version. It's just a lot more visually pleasing and interesting to me. In the second level, you'll experience the game's combat system for the very first time. Unlike Rayman 1, fights are few and far in between. Instead of having enemies that Rayman can just knock out with a couple of punches and be well on his way, enemies engage Rayman in a one-on-one battle. The Robo-Pirates, Razorbeard's army of robotic henchmen, will be your primary opponents. You'll also encounter piranhas, eyeball creatures, snakes, and zombie chickens. Zombie chickens. You're able to lock onto them with the shoulder button, allowing you to dodge and jump to avoid oncoming fire as you fire back at them. It's an okay battle system. It's not very in-depth, and it can get boring after quite some time. Though again, fights are infrequent, so this doesn't really happen. Along with the new battle system, there is a lot of new abilities Rayman can now perform. Rayman's now able to climb various surfaces such as vines and whatnot. Even if vines are on the ceiling, yeah, you can still climb on them. There's a lot of little things like this added to the game mechanics to increase the number of ways Rayman can navigate the world. This creates a lot of variety to the gameplay. Variety. Now there's a scary word. If you've watched my Tie 3 video a while ago, you probably know all too well that the ambition to add variety to a game can ultimately lead to a boring, mess, disorganized title. Luckily, Rayman 2 does it exceptionally well. The developers of Rayman understand all too well that variety in a game should be confined to the same core genre. So that doesn't mean, hey, we're getting bored of jumping, let's add an airplane stage.
No way, man! No fucking no! No, 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 fuck no!
Give me some vines to climb on, give me some barrels to dodge, give me something that still involves navigating an obstacle course. Like rockets with legs! But guess what? We're not shooting at dudes, we're still dodging stuff. Hey Chrome Studios, you probably should have looked at Rayman 2 as a core example, not Sonic Adventure 2. Rayman 2 has a lot of platforming variety, and it does it exceptionally well. Many of the best game mechanics that work so well in Rayman 1 are reintroduced and tweaked to work in a 3D environment. You know what that means? Yeah, you do. Ledge grabbing mechanics. Oh, they're back, and they work just as well as they did in Rayman 1. I don't think I've ever seen a unique mechanic in a 2D game carried on over to 3D this well before. To reiterate, when Rayman grabs a ledge, you're immediately able to jump from the hanging animation. This means you don't have to pull yourself up before being able to jump again. This creates an unmatched game feel that creates consistently great pacing. After rescuing Lee the Fairy, she then grants Rayman the power to swing on purple Lums. It's always really redundant when sequels to games make you obtain the exact same power-ups and items that you've already obtained in games prior. Luckily though, in Rayman 2, you'll have them all yet again by only the second level. A couple of temporary power-ups make a return, such as the Golden Fist that'll make Rayman's attack stronger until he takes 3 hits, and the ability to fly, which will last one entire level in the game. There's a lot of new stuff too, like powder kegs, which Rayman can carry around and use to blow open doors and destroy machines. Rayman's also able to throw the keg up into the air, allowing him to attack without, making it blow up. This way, Rayman can fend off enemies while trying to get the keg somewhere. Returning are those giant purple plums that you used to ride around in Rayman 1. You're now able to carry them in a similar fashion to powder kegs. Just like the first game, you're able to land them on the heads of enemies to create a platform, and you're also able to ride them over hazards. While it was usually spikes and water in Rayman 1, you'll mostly use plums to get across molten lava in Rayman 2. What are these things made out of? I'd hate to see someone eat them. I highly doubt their stomach acid would be able to digest it. Rayman 2 boasts a lot of high-speed action segments, the first being a level where you'll get to jet ski through a swamp. In some stages you'll get to ride a shell, which is a missile with legs that seems to think it's a horse. Stages where you get to ride these things are awesome. They're really tough though, since the shell will explode if you bump around too much or, run head-on into something. And remember those powder kegs? Well, what happens if we bring one near this torch over here? Go! These stages are similar to the shell stages as they're fast-paced and, you'll explode if you run into something. Though the shell is a little bit more durable than the kegs are, so when you're flying on the keg, try to be a little bit more careful. There's also a lot of slide segments that'll involve Rayman sliding down a large slope, making jumps and dodging obstacles. One of my favorite stages is called the Precipice. You'll find yourself frantically running forward as the stage behind you crumbles and falls into the abyss below as the pirate ships send a relentless onslaught of cannonballs your way. It's total mayhem, and you feel so badass running through this obstacle course that's constantly falling apart. Don't fall in the water here, though, because it's an instant death. Wait a minute. Why does water kill Rayman? He clearly demonstrated in other levels that he is able to swim. Oh, okay, piranhas. That seems to be a running excuse as to why you can't swim anywhere in this game. Can't swim in the swamp? Piranhas. Can't swim in the pond? Piranhas. Can't swim in the ocean? Piranhas. Yeah, that's right. You can't swim in the ocean because the entire thing is infested with piranhas. A part of this game that used to scare me as a kid is called the Cave of Bad Dreams. Early in the game, during the marsh level, there's a detour you can take that'll take you to Jano, a creepy eyeball creature. He tells you that you're not allowed to access the place he's guarding unless you know the name of it. Later in the game, you'll run into Rayman's large, burly friend Clark, who's been poisoned. He tells you to go to the Cave of Bad Dreams to get the antidote. Now, having learned the name, Jano lets you in, though he warns you that you'll have to find the antidote before he does, and if he catches up to you, he'll show you no mercy. There's nothing really that scary about the stage itself until you get to the part when you actually run into Jano. You're almost there, and you see him wretchedly pull himself out of the ground before deciding that he wants you for lunch. We then get this awesome slide segment from the point of view of inside his mouth. During the entire slide, you'll see the back of his teeth dripping and drooling with saliva as he thirsts for Rayman's flesh. This is so badass, but it scared the crap out of me the first time my mom rented this game for me. Actually, it scared me so much that I just straight up stopped playing the game until we brought the game back to the store. It wasn't until I actually owned the game a year later in my life that I would beat this level, with the moral support of my cousin who held my hand the whole way down there. Once at the bottom, you'll actually have a boss fight with Jano. After you defeat him, he offers you his entire hoard of treasure. If you accept, and yeah, you actually have a choice in the matter, you'll unlock an alternate ending featuring a very fat Rayman relaxing on an island in the middle of nowhere. But yeah, you obviously choose to take the antidote instead. The boss fights in Rayman aren't really much to write home about. The only one I'd consider great is the final boss. One of the bosses you don't even fight. You just jump on his head and he walks into the lava. I don't even know if you could consider that a boss. But the game presents him like he is one, so I guess he is? Regardless, each level leading up to the boss never fails to be a great time. Each one is so unique and special in its own way, constantly delivering platforming goodness without suffering from redundancy. It's pretty crazy that every single level in Rayman 2 offers something so radically different, yet it always manages to be really fun. I think it's safe to say that there isn't a single level in Rayman 2 that I actually don't like. Rayman 2 has 19 levels total, 2 of which are bonus levels and the last being the final boss fight. The PlayStation version of the game only has 17 levels, that and entire chunks of levels are missing completely. Like I mentioned before, this version is fully voice acted, but it's simply just not worth it for the axed content. One redeeming fact about the PS1 version is that you can unlock and play a beta build of the original 2D version of Rayman 2. You can unlock this by collecting 90% of the yellow Lums and then completing the game. In fact, the PS1 version only has 800 of the 1000 Lums. Well, 1000 becomes 999 after a cutscene where Razorbeard eats one. Jeez, is that barbarian? There is still a way to find that 1000th Lum though, and finding it is not easy. In one of the final levels, the Tomb of the Ancients, after climbing to the top of this wall here, jump off and helicopter all the way around this corner. Oh my god, how was anybody on Earth supposed to even find that? They hit that thing really well. In here is a giant skull with yellow Lum number 1000 in one of its eye holes. In the 3DS version, they completely ruined this secret because this little spiderweb net here you're supposed to bounce off of to get it, they forgot to make it so you can bounce off of it. So you just can't get the yellow Lum unless you activate some glitch where you get hit by an enemy and bounce up there. The final level consists of the most difficult and challenging slide stage yet, followed by one last shell level. But this time, this thing can fly. Rayman 2 really knows how to go out with a bang because this final shell segment rocks so hard. In the final fight against Razorbeard, you'll battle against the Grulgoth, a giant mech that Razorbeard literally purchased from a guy minutes before Rayman stormed his pirate ship. Once Razorbeard is defeated after an awesome final boss fight, Rayman frees his people and they celebrate the new peaceful world that Rayman has brought back. All in all, it's really not that hard to understand why a lot of people call Rayman 2 the greatest 3D platformer game that isn't Mario. It's crazy how well the transition from 2D to 3D actually went. I'd highly recommend the Dreamcast version over all other versions, though the N64 and PC versions are good too. Just make sure you avoid the PS1 version. Unless you don't mind not playing half of the game. So after not only a 2D masterpiece, but also a 3D masterpiece, comes Rayman 3, Hoodlum Havoc, for the GameCube, PS2, and Xbox. Does this even hold a candle to the first two? Yet it always manages to be really, really fun. I think it's safe to say that I don't like any level in Rayman 2. That's not what I meant to say.